official story of St. Petersburg goes like this. A young Russian king, Peter, decided to wander around in Europe for a couple of years, and he saw how civilized and wonderful people they are, how advanced they are, and he decided to bring this wonderful culture back to his country. So he hired a young French artist, Monferrand, who had no experience or much education of this, and he just told to this team of hired primates that Peter has hired how to build megaliths of look what quality. These are granite columns, gigantic ones, polished really to reflect like a mirror. So the mammals could build such things, moreover in a perfect antique style. Now I'm having a doubt that mammals without any education and tradition could build such things, because this is what builders nowadays make after going few years to specialized school. Now this modern piece is from this very same St. Petersburg, and is built by descendants of the very same people who supposedly some 200-300 years ago built the wonderful palaces. This is an old house in St. Petersburg, and the mammals just saw a sketch and made really like a replica of what could be seen in the Greek temples. Here are some walls from St. Petersburg. They look one-to-one to this wall in what we call ancient Greece. On the left is a column from Baalbek, and on the right is a St. Petersburg column. People nowadays admire the miracles of the ancient polygonal megalithic masonry in exotic places, but for the mammals in St. Petersburg this was just children's play. Polygonal masonry is everywhere. These are images from St. Petersburg only. This is not Peru. And this is not one of the ancient Egyptian megaliths, it's on the inside of one of St. Petersburg forts. The interiors as well consist of massive monolithic blocks, absolutely gigantic. You just whistle to a mammal and everything is done in no time, just like this. Now these were the grandparents of the mammal, but it seems something went wrong in the lineage with the genes, because when the children of the mammal try to repair the walls left by their parents, this is the pathetic result. And doesn't it look very familiar, very similar scene of what happens when the Incas try to repair the destroyed buildings of their gods? The similarities with the megaliths around the world are endless. For example, this is again from St. Petersburg. This very same technique is used regularly, that you put the stones, these are very hard granite stones, and you cut them in the shape you desire afterwards. So it seems the mammal were doing better even the advanced ones. That's supposedly we, because we don't do that. This is an example of the same technique being used in Japan, the Edo Castle or something like that, but the examples are endless and all around the world. The Great Pyramid in Giza, South America, endless. The main temple of the city, that now we call St. Isaac's Cathedral, and the main palace, the so-called Winter Palace, are both facing north. But not the current north, but the old North Pole, which is typical for many important buildings of the same style. The monument Medny Всадник is one of the emblems of St. Petersburg nowadays, and is supposedly a monument devoted to this great, wonderful King Peter. But upon closer examination, it turns out that somebody put a frisure on an old statue. This seems to be that very same horse rider that is depicted on coins since truly ancient times, and they give it different names to make it belong to their culture. It is Saint George, Alexander the Great, then somebody else, and somebody else. Originally, it must have been some important figure amongst the survivors. We don't know even who. But there are signs that the head has been replaced, and also the very posture. It looks like a person using a spear. Just the spear has been taken away, of course. Moreover, this King Peter wears Roman sandals. How suitable for the freezing winter temperatures of this region. They must have made the sketch for this statue when he was visiting Montenegro to play in the casinos or something like that. Also very strange that he has a sword that is typical for what commonly people call Roman times. And it has nothing to do with the swords that were used in the army during the actual times when King Peter lived. Moreover, the very simple design of the saddle, this was not used during the times of King Peter. At those times the saddles were already much more attached to the horse, while this is a very, again, Romaic style saddling of the horse. So they just changed the head of the old statue, put an inscription Peter, and so it became a brand new statue of King Peter that they are assuring us it was done on his time, and they are even giving us details who and how casted it and all that. The entire city of St. Petersburg is just full of Romaic style statues. So what to do with them? They can't do so much work to repair the heads of all, so they just change the name. And look at this. This is supposed to be some Russian general 200 years ago in full Romaic outfit and naked belly, and I really don't know. And at least for the main monuments they could hire people to write lies, but for the minor ones like this monument of General Suvorov, they didn't even bother to write a fraudulent story. They plainly said they found it in the fields. Even in the official version, this statue was found on the field of Mars. Well, most probably this is a statue of Mars indeed. But we are supposed to believe that, I don't know, it grew on a bush and it had the shape of General Suvorov, or I don't know what. There are some seriously heavy megaliths in St. Petersburg that place serious questions. Alexander Column is famous as the largest freestanding column and the largest column in the world made out of a single stone slab. Some 62 meters high, 3.5 meters in diameter, and weighing nearly 700 tons. But the huge columns throughout the city are just many of them. These are the ones from St. Isaac's Cathedral, much smaller than the Alexander Column, but just get an idea of their size compared to the humans next to them. And these are on the top colonnade of the St. Isaac's Cathedral. I have asked in a video months or weeks ago, I gave their dimensions. Do we have a technology that nowadays is able to lift and fix columns with such a weight at such height? Because I heard journalists commenting that we still don't have such a technology, and I have received no responses at all from any builders who would suggest that we have such technology even nowadays for working with such columns, and yet we are offered to believe that in the very recent past the mammals erected these columns just with ropes and bare hands. These are illustrations of the official version of how the Alexander column was erected within 2 hours, believe it or not. Nowadays, there was a Soviet Union rocket waiting somewhat less than the column, and it took them many hours to put the rocket in upright position using most advanced for us technology, and yet using ropes they did it within 2 hours. Or in Turkey, they were erecting some sort of satellite tower or something of almost the same weight as the Alexander column, and it took them 2 days, again using modern equipment. And by the way, the sheer weight of the column, almost 700 tons, makes it quite ridiculous to suggest that this could be installed with the help of ropes. The famous Russian writer Alexandra Lorenz, she took some time and she made research into strength of different ropes, and she found out that for make this hypothetic fantasy system of ropes as depicted on these fantasy illustrations, they would need to be 36 centimeters wide. I mean the diameter of the rope. And that by itself makes it absolutely unmanageable, and by the way, too heavy to use anyway, because the full system of ropes would weigh too many tons by itself to be moved by the workers. What to speak of the column on the top of that? And by the way, you can't tie a rope with diameter of 36 centimeters anyway. This full scenario is a complete joke, and is nothing else but an attempt to bamboozle the future generations about their true history. And by a lot of the interesting points in this video are taken from the very same research article by Alexandra Lorenz, so we are obliged to her a lot for revealing the truth. But what about the truth about the Alexander column? We saw that the official version is ridiculous, but then what is the alternative? Well, I can't say for sure, but I will put forward the hypothesis based on this and much more information. There was, example, a collection of older paintings that now I lost somewhere in the computer, strongly suggesting that the Alexander column existed before its official erection date. Most likely the column and the full city was modified according to the new parasitic plan, and most of the amazing stuff there was already there before its official building date. This is again another painting of a contemporary artist who was not famous, and he was not a part of this establishment that was bribing artists of that year and historian writers to compile the fake history. So this simple man, he was drawing whatever he saw out of his window, and nobody knew. Otherwise, maybe they would have destroyed this painting. So what we see here is they're dismantling a small structure at the base of the column and modifying the column itself, because this scaffolding cannot withstand the column. And the full situation looks like a repair or modification and not like a building. It's more like a destruction. The column could have been, again, this is my hypothesis and it's not yet proven, for example, a device for transmitting atmospheric electricity and distributing it to the city. Because the question comes here, why place this column anyway? There isn't anything important on the top of it, just one of the thousands angel figures that are found all over the city anyway. And it was built relatively recently according to mainstream history, so they can't come up with the usual lie that our forefathers were just blinded by religious prejudices and thought that the bigger the stones, the more the gods will be happy with them, or other nonsense. There is no official explanation given of why would people in the not so recent past supposedly do such a useless and painstaking work of erecting such a huge column that has no function, no apparent function at all, and moreover constructed from a single piece of stone, if it is stone at all, and if it is single, that I will touch later, but that's what they are assuring us. And why didn't they use the technique of making it from composite parts, a technique that is well known to humanity since thousands of years? We are making columns made out of smaller component. It's much easier to work that way. On the other hand, the penguins assure us that the scenes depicted at the base of the column celebrate the victory of Russia over Napoleon, which happened in the not so far away past. Then how to explain the Romaic outfits, sphinxes, and the gods of the survivor culture depicted all over? Were they also taking part in the battles? And why the coat of arms and all the symbols on their shields and everything is like the warriors of Romaic times? For example, exactly the ones depicted on the Trajan column in the center of Rome. Supposedly that one was made a couple of thousand years ago, and here we see the same stuff, doesn't fit at all. Also, some elements seem to have been added later on, like this one, for example. A thin line of metal of other composition is visible. Probably they just welded it at later stage, because the inscription or whatever was below it could reveal the truth of what is this column and this battle all about. And just to wind up with the topic of the free electricity from atmospheric electricity that I'm suggesting, if the Alexander column was initially made to distribute it, then all these antenna-like devices that we see on some old depictions, they would nicely fit in the full systems. Then they would be the receptacles for such an electricity. And by the way, the full set of palaces was subjected to regular so-called by chance fires that would destroy everything, and they would rebuild it again. Now the description of those fires the various descriptions are all very fishy, and they seem to have been artificially created. I don't know why, but probably it could have been to erase the memory of whatever technology was still there left from the survivor times, and to substitute it gradually with each subsequent fire with something more primitive. Indeed, there are old texts suggesting that the very residents of the palaces themselves commented that every time the palace is worse when they make it, when they renovate it. It shouldn't be like that if the official history is correct, because they should have been progressing at that time instead of going down, and especially the situation as they presented in Russia at that time to us. Apparently, some very strong spirits took part in the creation of these architectural masterpieces of St. Petersburg. Like, for example, Augustin Bicantur. The mainstream thick books about the history of St. Petersburg assure us that he took very active part in the erection of the Alexander column. Which is a very fascinating story because he died at least 10 years before the column was erected, according to the very same mainstream history. Situation is not less weird with the other main characters of their historic fairy tales. For example, we're supposed to believe a little bit that this is the grave of the famous architect Montferrand who made it all happen and showed those sketches to the mammals. Well, actually, this is the only thing left from him, and it is a hypothesis that this is his grave, and the hypothesis is based on the fact that the letter M is engraved on this gravestone. Otherwise, he did not have any family, descendants, friends, relatives, or anything that he would leave any personal belongings or any information of how St. Petersburg was built or anything of this sort at all. And not only him, all the main builders and people concerned or responsible somehow, none of them has family alive. I mean, this is weird. If it would concern one or two people that participated in the full thing, it wouldn't be weird. But when all of the main characters are some sort of phantoms that didn't leave anything substantial behind, one starts questioning, did these people really exist? Or if they did, was the story like this, or what is happening actually? And this episode now is kind of continuation to one of the previous episodes about Tartaria, where I showed how foreigners took over the academic circles in Russia completely and totally. They took 100% over the history department and started creating whatever history suits their plans in some way, and forging in this way the history of St. Petersburg is just one small part of their overall plan. So all of the engineering sketches or what, I don't know, or maybe they were not, because they told us they worked only with intuition, how all these parts matched with each other so perfectly. I mean, look at this table, it's polished with digital accuracy. This is absurd to be made only with intuition. So anyway, all the plans and information about technology, it's all gone from Russia, but Montferrand, mainstream history is assuring us, went back to France and he published this album where there were 24 illustrations as well about how St. Petersburg was built. And this album is now the most authentic and most respected source of authentic information of how St. Petersburg was built. But when starting to think about what we see on his illustrations, we're quite confused. Like, this is, for example, supposed to illustrate how they chop off the boulder from which they would make the future Alexander column, supposedly. This is what we see in the details. A man is inserting a long road in the stone. Well, how do you do that? There is no description. Currently, we cannot do that. We cannot just put 2-3 meters high nails in the stone and then chop it off. And if indeed Montferrand was a builder himself, why wouldn't he share with us how did they do it? And all of his things are like this. For example, this is how he illustrates the transportation of the enormous amount of heavy megalithic stones, few tons each. Some of them weighed many tons, and this complete setting is fantasy. I mean, this is not work for 4 men. You would need much more than 4 men to drag this, and much better equipment. These ropes are some sort of, I don't know, for dolls, or one wonders, are these paintings really done from what he has seen, or for some other reason? Yes, people did transport rather huge stones with primitive means in the past, and some valuable photos have survived till nowadays, and we can see for what kind of stones, what were they using actually. Like, this is the relatively small one, the small stone hanging below the cart. And this is probably the best one because it shows the same size stone like the one on Montferrand's photos, and you see how many buffaloes are needed for its transportation. Here again, notice the size of the cart and what kind of stone was it used to transport. And this is our best equipment nowadays, used to transport such things. It is included in the Guinness records. Look at its monstrous size, and still it can only lift half of the Alexander column as its maximum allowed load. And this is a fairy tale illustration of how they supposedly loaded the Alexander column, which according to some description was not even completed at that time, so could have weighted, according to them, some up to 1,400 tons. And they put it on a boat just like that. I don't know. If we speak realistically, these are some pictures when they were transporting a real Egyptian obelisk weighing only 244 tons, and very special arrangements needed to be made. As you can see, they needed to construct special chamber in the ship and so on and so on. I mean, this is real stuff, and the other one, it simply doesn't work in reality. These were the arrangements they made for transporting the base of the obelisk, which weighted only 40 tons. So after seeing these real photographs, make your own conclusions about the credibility of the Montferrand illustrations. Now, this Saint Isaac's Cathedral was officially built for 40 years, starting year 1818 through year 1858, while the first column of it was erected, according to them, in year 1825. And yet official documents, the legitimacy of which is not disputed by anybody, like this one, mention it as already existing a building even before that. Numerous artists also depicted standing at its place years before its construction supposedly started, and many of them during this period, 40-year period of suggested construction time, yet they see it all completed during this period and functioning. Just pay attention to the year below each artwork. And this is what Montferrand sees. The others see functioning cathedral, and Montferrand sees scaffolding and construction site. Whom to believe? Officially, the city was founded in year 1703 by this great King Peter, who placed the first cornerstone of the first building in that year, 1703. And these are the official old maps of the city. Official means they are made relatively recently for the purpose of putting them in the history books and the textbooks. Pay attention at the dates. I mean the year which they supposedly depict. And yet contemporary artists depict this just a couple of years after the first cornerstone was laid down. Supposedly at this time the king was approving only the projects on paper, yet in reality we see a full functioning city. And also pay attention to the lovely layout of the city, the straight wide avenues and its neat configuration. Now this is a very interesting actual old map where they call the place Tartarskaya Sloboda, which means free place of Tartaria. So most likely what happened actually, this was one of the last strongholds of the free Tatars, descendants of the survivors. And all these strange stories in the official history about St. Petersburg are nothing else but an attempt to cover the truth and make it look like something completely different. Out of all the illustrations in the Monferrand album that he published in Paris, this one seems to be the only one of some value. Here he shows that there were older ruins, and these ruins were exactly, so to say, survivor style, Baalbek style. The patterns that are marked with red here are the main patterns of the famous Baalbek temple. They are not in the official history, but there is confirmation of older ruins. Now this is from St. Petersburg. In the rare cases, when one can get a glimpse what is a few meters below the surface, that's what they find. It's a quite fine quality of letter carving here. And at other places as well, below the foundation of the building, something else ancient looking sticks out. But even if the Russian King Peter only remodeled the palaces of St. Petersburg and was not their original builder, it doesn't matter. The most important is that even during the renovation, still techniques were used that we cannot even imagine. We cannot explain at all how many of these shiny columns and countless luxury items could have been manufactured without the help of advanced technology. And that questions not only the validity of the mainstream history, but also the validity of the most popular model of history suggested by the alternative researchers, who usually think that there was an advanced ancient civilization that got destroyed by natural disasters some 12,000 years ago. Then how come we have so many items that show the signs of advanced technology and are definitely not thousands of years old? And moreover, they are exactly in this survivor style. Although they have named it neoclassicism, this means nothing because this name has been placed by the mainstream history, which is a big joke. And these questions about St. Petersburg are extremely important. They are not at all local just to Russia because there are traces of this so-called neoclassical style all over the world. So let's see a bit in detail all these items that are beyond the primitive techniques that were the only ones supposedly available a few hundred years ago. I mean manual, nearly primitive. And see what we can conclude from them about the real history, and later on we'll return briefly to all those buildings in Africa, in the Middle East, in the same style, and we'll see how it's actually a lie. They always tell us that some colonialists came and built them. There was nothing like that. Invaders do different things. Open the news and you will see what invaders do. They don't build fantastic buildings wherever they go. Is one of the thousands of altars in St. Petersburg. Let's look at the flowers. Artists and sculptors nowadays attend specialized educational institutions for years, and yet they are unable to achieve a quality even remotely similar to this using only manual simple tools. That is why they used 2D, 3D and even other more complex technologies nowadays to get such results. While the mammals 300 years ago were just shown a sketch and they would make it easily. And on the top of that, all the elements made of different materials would come together magically and the sizes would fit perfectly, although the mammals would have never even heard about an uniform measuring system according to the textbooks in Russia, which persistently quote only foreigners about how all this was made. Gigantic vases of stunning qualities are found all over the palaces. In some cases, the vases are bigger than the doors of the rooms where they are situated. Yet the penguins assure us that they were manufactured by this and that worker and then they were brought to the site. While some photos from the restoration team suggest a completely different picture, that they were cast and maybe cast on the spot. That's why they're bigger than the doors. This picture suggests that actually the mammals knew recipes of how to cast out of materials that are very similar to natural semi-precious stones. But I think we're just being lied about all this so that we are not aware that very recently people knew of such recipes. Now, statues are like this are numerous and they place many questions. For example, on his special collar inside, it is also perfectly polished and smooth. You know, in these holes, if they were doing it manually, how would they reach inside and smooth it so perfectly? And also on a bit upper, there are still drill holes visible. While we're being assured that the mammals didn't have any tools at all. I think these are just lies so that we don't inquire into what kind of tools were these people still using. These were the tools that were still left from the survivors' era. Now this is a remote and an important location in the outskirts of St. Petersburg, and the material is what appears to be an extremely hard black variety of granite. Now to achieve this quality using only manual tools is quite insane. I mean, you would need a factory working couple of years only on the elements of this, and it's even double. But if you cast this out of geopolymer, yes, then it is relatively easy and fast to accomplish. Some of the columns give the impression that they would be solid, at least somewhat solid inside. Others are definitely hollow, or at least partially hollow. The history of building techniques assures us that the hollow columns technique is a relatively recent invention and should not have existed few hundred years ago. But here it becomes obvious that this history of building is not meant to inform people, but it is just another tool to used to artificially re-endorse and provide fraudulent evidence for the fraudulent mainstream history and nothing else. Also, the penguins who write the so-called history of building techniques pretend not to notice that many of the columns in St. Petersburg have horizontal stripes of various colors, which strongly suggests that they were cast at some point out of geopolymer, and this is not a really and fully natural stone. Yet one more evidence that the culture that built St. Petersburg was the same one that built all the various so-called very ancient megaliths all around the world. The technique is very similar. Or even if the stripes are left by some special tools, still the question remains why we don't know anything about these tools and why the textbooks tell us that the monkeys had no tools at all and did it all with intuition. And most probably those primates, mammals, knew even much more than that. For example, these gigantic statues, also of stunning quality and size, they are very similar to each other, but yet not identical. So it wasn't just simple casting, maybe. To make us believe that mammals freshly caught from the forest could build these palaces, they are telling us about some tough stone which was supposedly very soft and very easy to work with. Of course now it's not available, but it was supposedly available at that time, and I'm having the feeling that even if such stone existed, they are not telling us the full story, because we see clear machine tools, some sort of machine, maybe not even electricity powered, but some sort of machinery on the stones, and yet textbooks assure us that it was all run on intuition without machinery or measurement. On the top of that, this very same tough stone has got armature inside. That's amazing that it grows like this in the fields with the armature inbuilt in it. Isn't it amazing? And on the other hand, please pay attention to the close details of where such a stone or a geopolymer meets with the next elements to him made of other material. One clearly sees how the soft mixture was not properly shaped at the very edges where the instrument wouldn't reach easily, and that's where it transpires that in these cases this was cast out of geopolymer, and it's not natural stone from the woods, as they say. Now here somebody found valuable evidence from Siberia, and this is from the era where photography already existed. Now this is what people were making at that time, and we are tamed always to immediately say, oh, this is a stonework. But on the next shot, the truth transpires. Here they are caught on photograph how they are casting it out of geopolymer. They sometimes fail to clean up everything in their endeavors to cover up the real history. And this could be yet another old, very valuable painting, that illustration that they have not removed by mistake, and which could be very well showing how they are casting out the columns of the palaces in St. Petersburg. Because this is an authentic old illustration, and it is still part of the official collection that shows the building of the palaces or their remodeling, whatever it is. Officially, the amazing palace in which nowadays the Hermitage Museum is housed, one of the richest museums in the world, some regard it as the biggest collection of fine art on the planet. So this was officially built within 8 years. And so many people believe this, although nowadays we, the so-called advanced ones, cannot complete anything of this sort within 8 years at all. And a good comparisons would be the stadiums that are built especially for the Olympic Games. They cannot compare neither in terms of size nor in terms of complexity of work with the vast complex of palaces in St. Petersburg. The palaces are much more complex. Look at these intricate details. So just compare the time needed to make this modern sports equipment, which is quite plain in comparison to this fine stuff. And then you will quickly figure out that there is something profoundly wrong with this so-called history that they're selling to us. And also in terms of funding, supposedly Russia was a very poor and undeveloped country when all this was built. How could they finance it? It would be out of question if it was indeed all true. Now, in relation to the photos of Siberia that we saw earlier, I would like to share a personal experience of mine. Many years ago, really many, when I have never even heard about the history of the survivors and so on, and believed more or less the mainstream history, I was traveling somewhere in the deep provinces of Eastern Europe, and I was profoundly impressed by the small transformer stations or transformer posts of this size. And they were of style and quality very similar to this image from Siberia. But I didn't know about the Siberian photo at that time, and I felt as if I'm in ancient Egypt. I thought, well, it would be very nice. How could one build actually a house like this? There should be some sort of technology that we know of, and why are we always talking that the megaliths of Egypt are a mystery when we're building the same nowadays? Now I understand that those transformer stations were actually indeed more or less recent from the survivors' time that ended some maybe in places 200 years ago. At least in terms of forgetting the actual techniques, building techniques, or at least the last poor remnants, morsels that we remembered. Well, to continue the story, at that time I even contacted a few engineers with the question, how can one build a house like this? That would be wonderful. One would feel as one lives in an ancient Egyptian megalith. And of course, everybody assured me that this should be easily possible, but when it came out to finding how exactly, there was no clue. And I would like to illustrate for you how memory bleaching can occur very swiftly within a few generations, and very valuable information can be forgotten, and nobody would be even aware what we are losing. For example, on many herbal medicines, herbs that are still fortunately sold in the pharmacies, you will see a writing, this is not meant to prevent or cure any disease. This is only a food supplement. and still you have to follow the directions of your physician when you take it. Actually, this is ridiculous because we all know that herbs are exactly curing and preventing disease and are doing it in a much more efficient way than many of the current poisons in the vests of medicines. The nasty chemical stuff that is labeled as actual and proper medicine. Now we know that. However, in a few generations, if this parasitic scheme continues to develop as they plan it, uh, in few generation people will lose more and more their connection with nature. The old knowledge of how the herbs actually work, we still know somewhat about it, but it will be lost almost completely within few generation. And then all those lies that this is not meant to cure or prevent any disease and this is a food only, all those lies will be believed as absolute reality by the people after 100 or 200 years. All that combined with the regular smear campaigns against the use of herbs, and here you have the good old knowledge forgotten. So the same was the case with the building techniques. People had much better and ecologically friendly building techniques, but gradually they were put into the modern of that time building. Many people should have been aware that the modern is worse than the old. Many must have protested as well. But what do we know about it nowadays? Nothing. In the same way as people in 200 years may be given little information about the protests nowadays that are going on against this smear campaigns of herbs and nature cure. And if people are able to forget that much within just a couple of 100 years, then just imagine how much they can forget within 20,000 years. And I'm saying 20 because it's very hard to say when this mixing of the advanced angels and magicians from Hyperborea and Atlantis started with the primitive tribes, but the very approximate time that we have for now is at least 20,000 years. And all this 12 story of a grand natural disaster that wiped out an advanced civilization 12,000 years ago is nothing but a mainstream pollution that is still remaining in the alternative history and needs to be cleaned out to find out the truth. But let's land back in St. Petersburg. There is this gigantic strange head there. The mainstream explanation is again very, very fishy. And again some strange holes in the gigantic columns. We really know very little of what was the equipment or the thing that was attached there, or for what purpose are they, and everything is hollow inside. And then the corners. This is how we make corners nowadays because it's difficult. We need some advanced laser technology to make it all in one piece. It's possible only in jewelry sizes, otherwise it's too difficult. Yet they made it in a completely different way with surprising ease. The examples of internal corners with excellent quality of work are endless. Do you still believe that uncombed mammals did all this using only intuition, no tools, no measurement? The yellow arrow shows the old stuff done by the mammals, and the red arrows show what we could do, how we renovated it. Well, maybe they are monkeys indeed, and we are the monkeys to believe the mainstream history. If indeed the level of technology was as it is suggested by the mainstream history, this is the quality of the art pieces that we would find only. This is fully consistent with the picture that they paint of those times. And such artifacts do exist indeed, but along with them there is a completely different class of artifacts, and they are not at all reviewed by the mainstream history. We are being assured that all the tiny metal rings of which this vest consists are manually made by blacksmiths in a very primitive way. But then how come all the rings are absolutely identical? This is impossible without machinery. And really, was somebody that crazy to spend their time chiseling the name of the manufacturing unit on each and every tiny and small ring? Were they using a needle as a chisel? This is insane. The original architects glorified the old gods, the true guardians and well-wishers of the human race. But during the subsequent numerous modifications, this was largely replaced by Masonic symbols, and so our true history was hijacked. Just here and there a few places remained untouched, and we get an idea that the palaces were quite different when originally designed. But many of the large statues that are difficult to replace are still there. The stone elements of which various stone structures are composed often come in very odd shapes that would be very inconvenient to make if one is really dealing with actual granite blocks, and so much has to be removed from the block to get such a shape. Also, it would be very inconvenient and more complicated to plan it beforehand unless you are casting it on the spot. Also, some materials seem to be a bit odd, like this one, for example, looks like the red granite, but without the darker grains, so maybe in this mixture they simply did not put grains. All the brothers of this one are actually cylinders standing upright, but this one was maybe too soft when they removed the mold, or again the mixture went wrong. Too many clues lead towards the casting version, and yet somehow the mainstream historians don't want us to know about this. Parts of Petersburg, some of those parts that were built in survivor-style architecture, have seen the Great Flood. This is also true for most, or maybe even all, the Russian cities in this Siberian region that I call Hyperborean region. Do you notice the strange design of the buildings? Half of their windows buried in the ground. This is how such buried windows look on the inside. They were not originally meant to be like this. These were proper buildings. Their first floor was above ground level. Look at the building on the right side. Only the tops of the arches are sticking now above ground, and this was a proper first floor in the past. Now look at the red building at the background. Just few centimeters of the first floor are now sticking from the ground. In some places, people dug out their doors to use them again, and yet in others they made stairs and opened new doors on the second floor. Mainstream historians are trying to assure us that all this thick layer of mud, of clay, is a cultural layer, they call it. Supposedly, it never crossed people's minds to sweep their street, and eventually, dirt, the dust outside, took over their houses to the extent that covered some of them completely. This is ridiculous. For example, this happened when one of these buried buildings gave in and a hole opened in the street. Do you really believe that such a garbage would pile up within 200 years so fast, and the people wouldn't even notice how their windows are gradually getting covered up with the garbage? Or maybe these were the falling off peels of bananas and coconuts from the workers that were making the city. Actually, there are no cultural layers and there is no garbage at all. These layers are of thick clay. And only below this couple of clay layers, there is the actual soil with humus. Fertile soil that forms naturally. This is true for all these regions of cities that have been buried in such way. Usually, two consecutive thick layers of clay are noticed. In some places, they reach over 2 meters of thickness. This is one of the St. Petersburg palaces when devastated by one of the fires. And this is a cellar in St. Petersburg, a window to nowhere, to the ground. If this was not a proper first floor one, once upon a time, why would they put a window there? And this is a star fort, officially classified as a medieval invention, again buried under many layers of thick clay. This is how layers of thick clay land all of a sudden somewhere. And interestingly enough, all the old drawings of St. Petersburg depict the city with the first floor already buried in clay. This gravure is supposedly from the time when the city was just built, and yet already people started making extra arrangements for additional staircases to make their doorways on the second floor. All this is yet another reason to believe that St. Petersburg was not built by this King Peter, but was just remodeled. As we are gonna see later in this episode, the location of St. Petersburg is one of the weirdest and most unsuitable places that one could find on the planet to build a city, not to mention a capital of the biggest country on the planet. If you wanna get flooded all the time, this is the place to be. But yet, interestingly enough, all these floods that are well recorded here, as you can see on the photographs and on some paintings, together with the year that happened, they did not affect the buildings as such. I mean, the way we see them on the drawings, as much as they stick on the ground, on the first drawings from the time the city was supposedly made, that's how they look nowadays. Absolutely same situation. So it seems those great floods that brought few meters of clay on the top of the city were somewhat extraordinary. and could be of somewhat a different nature than the regular St. Petersburg floodings, because even cities in Russia that do not suffer from floodings at all are not located in such zones are buried under layers of thick mud. And I really hope to start a discussion. The humanity should start thinking who is burying us under layers of clay and so selectively. This is not just in the Hyperborean region and not just these cities. In the previous episodes, I've shown so many places with the same problem, selectively buried, just the sites that contain artifacts or buildings in the style of the survivors. They are only buried with something as if dumped from above, and the rest around is normal with fertile soil that forms naturally. Another excellent example all the way from Greece, from the ancient site of Amphipolis. A very thick layer of clay, exactly on the site, with gorgeous, huge statues of the gods of the survivors. Nothing like this in the fields around there. But let's get back to the Hyperborean region and see some of the actual artifacts that archaeologists have found under these thick layers of mud. They found coins. Look at the year of the coinage. So just 200 years ago, 2 meters of clay landed upon the land, and this is nowhere in the historic records. Well, bravo! And that is not just one location. These are hundreds of big cities in Russia. This coin also, year 730, is it 4 or 1? Or 1731, according to the newly imagined history. Well, it doesn't matter in any case, this is some 300 years ago. And they also find a pipe system that could not have functioned under freezing temperatures like the ones you get now in the region. So it was designed to function in some other weather. This will be a very useful fact in one of the future episodes when we are gonna reveal the frauds about the very ancient Ice Age. Also, they find wooden structures that are amazingly well preserved, and yet they try to date them as something very ancient, very strange. And this is what they find along such platforms, and that's how they date them. They find such things there as well, somewhat Egyptian looking. Strange that they didn't bring the Egyptians here in their hypothesis as well. And most amazingly, although the excavations were done during summer, this is what they uncovered. They found a layer of snow and ice below the layer of clay. This is quite amazing. I don't know how would you interpret that, but I myself see as a possibility that all these events happened really suddenly, and that's why this ice and snow could remain preserved in such a pristine condition till now.